Isn't it amazing what technology can do these days? I hear they now have a computer that you can speak into and it will sing the words back in a song. And do you know which brand of computer has the best singing voice? It's Adele. Yes, today on A Guide to Podcasting, we're talking all things vocal. Hi there, I'm Rob Poynton. Thanks for joining me today on Dragon's Teeth for the third in our series on setting up a podcast. So we've spoken about the subject matter, we've spoken about the gear you're going to need to record. Today we're looking at the next most important aspect, your voice. And we're going to start by thinking about the very first thing that people are going to hear when they tune into your podcast. Normally, this is going to be some type of theme music, a little intro, maybe some sound effects, that sort of thing. And of course, this is largely determined by the subject matter of your podcast. You want to have something appropriate. If it's serious political issues or social issues you're talking about, you don't necessarily want, I don't know, like the Benny Hill theme or something at the start. So it is important to get this right. It's also important because when you think about it, every TV show ever made, ever, has theme music. And of course, we come to associate that theme music with the show. It's one of the ways we identify it. So having this little bit of music at the start really acts as an identifier for your show. And when you get it right, it's almost like a reassuring thing. You hear this in your headphones, you think, oh yeah, I'm in the right place. This is what I want to be listening to. So what sort of things do we need to be aware of when we're choosing our theme music for the show? I can give you a few don'ts to start off with. And first I'll just mention, I tend to listen to podcasts on my earbuds, and it tends to be while I'm out on my bike or while I'm doing something else. Other than that, I'll be listening in the car when I'm going on a long drive somewhere. But my earphones is the usual way I consume my podcasts. And what I really dislike, and I've had a couple of times, is a podcast that starts off with some sound effect, like a dentist drill. I remember one podcast, and that was the very first thing you heard was this high-pitched whine. Well, that's going off straight away. The second thing, my second biggest peeve, is people sometimes put that sound effect of someone turning a dial on an old radio. Viewers of a certain age will remember this. You know, you had to dial in the station, and so you got all this static and little bits of the station fading in and out. Again, it's not a pleasant, soothing noise. That's not to say necessarily that your theme music needs to be pleasant and soothing, because you might be doing a sort of horror-based podcast, for example, but it needs to be not too harsh on the ears. You know, you can build up an atmosphere with suspenseful music without assaulting the ears. I mean, a great example of this, probably the best example I can think of, is the HP Podcast guys, who had a nice atmospheric bit of music at the start, and halfway through it was this scream, but it's not right in your ears scream, it's off at a distance somewhere, but it was very effective. In fact, so effective that even now they've changed the name of the show. They are now Strange Studies of Strange Stories, I believe. They've changed the music and everything else, but that scream stays in there. That's become a nice identifier for their podcast. So where do you look for this music? How do you get it? If you're a musician and you have access to recording on the computer, which I think most musicians I know do, then you can make something up yourself. Perhaps you've got a friend who's a musician. I'm sure they'd do something for you. It doesn't really take long to put a few chords together with some strings over the top or whatever it is, and the job is done. Other than that, you can of course look around on the internet, and you want to make sure you're getting royalty and copyright free music that is available for use in other projects. Don't be tempted to think, oh, the theme from the Sweeney, that was great, wasn't it? Da 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 da. We'll have that as our opening theme. You might find whoever owns the rights to that music will have something to say about that. The other thing then is, how long should this piece of music be? To my mind, I would say 30 to 60 seconds, not really any longer than that. I have listened to some podcasts that have maybe 2 or 3 minutes of intro music. To me, that's far too long, for a couple of reasons. One, we're all busy, right? I want to get into listening to the thing I want to listen to. But secondly as well, if I'm in a position where I've got my earbuds in and my MP3 player is now down in my pocket somewhere, obviously I'm working to the level of that music. Sometimes then if the voice comes in and it's a lot quieter or a lot louder than that music, I've now got to fish around and get the MP3 out and adjust the volume again. So we'll be talking about volume in a moment with the voice. But I think it's good if you can limit the amount of time that people have to fiddle around with stuff just in order to listen to your podcast. So 30 to 60 seconds, you got your nice little ident, and then you're in to the meat of the podcast. And just to give you a couple of examples of what we do, I'll play now the Innsmouth Book Club intro and then Strange Shadows. So they're both in a similar field. They're both podcasts about weird fiction. But the setup for the IBC is that you are being taken on a visit to Innsmouth, and we're going to take you to the library or the cinema or wherever it is to talk about whichever book or film we're talking about. So what we're trying to do at first is establish that atmosphere of just arriving in Innsmouth or just being in Innsmouth. And this is what that sounds like.
Welcome to Innsmouth, stranger.
Greetings, travellers, and welcome to episode 90 of the Innsmouth Book Club podcast. As you can see, we've brought you directly to the Gilman House Hotel because today we're
as you can see, we have our little soundscape, then we have some intro music, and the vocal intro comes in over that intro music. We fade that out as the vocal comes in, so that works very nicely for us. Strange Shadows is looking at the work of a specific author, Clark Ashton Smith, so we're not really trying to set an atmosphere of place, but we still want to establish something of a weird fiction atmosphere. So Strange Shadows sounds like this.
Strange Shadows, a Clark Ashton Smith podcast.
It was in the fall of 1947, 3 days prior.
So that's our intro sorted, and the voice is now coming in. So let's talk about vocals. In effect, what we're doing when we create a podcast or any kind of broadcast is speaking in public. And from research I've done on fear control is something we talk about a lot in our martial arts training, of course, and similar areas. And apparently one of the biggest fears that people have is of talking in public. So it's a strange thing in that case to want to actually be doing that as a hobby or a pastime or as an interest. Now, of course, we aren't all blessed with the stentorian tones of a Shakespearean actor, which is often a trained thing, right? People go to RADA or to drama school to learn how to do that. And there are people who just have naturally sounding, very nice voices, rich and fruity perhaps, or mellifluous, that's the word. You know, they seem to be natural talkers. For most of us, when we actually break our conversation down, we and we are, and we mumble and we cough, and we sometimes say the same word a few times over, all that kind of stuff. Now, that's all fine, that's all great, but how do we work all this into a professional sounding podcast? So let's break this down into sections, and the first thing we're going to talk about is modulation. This generally means the volume of your voice, the volume that you are speaking at. And as I've already mentioned, it's a good idea to have in your mix your vocal volume matching the music volume, so we don't have this big step as the two transition. That is usually done in editing, of course, but when we're actually speaking, we need to be aware of the volume of our voice as well. There's a couple of things to be aware of. One, I found that I did myself, and I've certainly heard a few other people do it, is when you first start recording, your very first words, because you're sort of a little bit tense and excited, can come out very loud. So I'm just going to increase my volume for a moment, so be warned, and it will go something like this. The music fades out and you go, "Hello, welcome to our podcast." And then you start talking normally, and everyone at home is going, "Oh, for God's sake," right? So you need to be aware of what your general volume is, and you work to maintain that throughout. So when you open your podcast, you say, "Hello and welcome to our podcast. Thanks for joining us today." And then you're going to go on talking in that same volume. The other side of the coin for that, of course, is people who might talk at this volume, you know, it's a nice steady volume, and then they'll kind of, you know, very occasionally with guests we've had that, people start going very low, and then you have to make a decision. Do you stop them talking and ask them to speak up, or is that something you're going to fix in the edit? And I think the time that did happen, we actually tried to fix it in the edit, because we were a bit shy about saying anything to a guest. So do try and keep your modulation even across your whole podcast. It doesn't mean you can't have slight changes in volume, of course, because we don't speak at one volume all the time in that kind of voice. You know, there's natural ups and downs. Just be aware of things as well when you laugh, for example. If it's a sort of podcast that you laugh in, then sometimes it's good just to ease back from the microphone a little bit. What I tend to do when Tim says something funny, which is quite often because we do make each other laugh quite a bit, is if my mic is here, I'll just turn away from it a little bit so we're not getting that full volume laugh straight into the mic. Again, it's something that you can fix in editing, but editing is a long slog as it is. It's a long process. So the less you have to do in editing, the better it is. The second thing we're going to talk about is tone. What is the tone of your voice? Now, this can cover a couple of things. We can think of tone in terms of serious or light-hearted. So almost like an emotional tone, I guess. Do you want to sound sad? Do you want to sound happy? That sort of thing. Again, this is very much determined by the nature of your podcast. If it is a serious issue you're talking about, then it's probably not a good idea to start talking like this. If it's more light-hearted or a natural tone of conversation type podcast, then, you know, you just be natural with it. And that is a thing with a lot of this as well. You want to imagine most of the time you're having a conversation with someone. You're actually talking to someone. Sometimes you will be, of course, if you're working with other people. But if you are sitting there on your own, just staring at the camera or the microphone, you have to imagine almost there's a group of people standing behind that, and that's who you're talking to. Otherwise, you can find the tone can become very flat. And it's something, again, I was aware of at the start, particularly when we were starting reading stuff out. So you might read a quote or a section from a story, and it is quite easy to start reading it out like this. Now, you don't have to be a great voice actor or anything else, but you always want to maintain either that conversational, friendly tone, or perhaps a sort of authoritative tone, again, depending on the nature of the information that you're putting across. By the way, just speaking about comedy there, I sometimes think comedy is one of those things that everyone thinks they can do really well, but actually there are not so many who can. So if you're a natural raconteur or wit and you're the sort of person at a party, you can just say, oh, I saw this the other day, and you can deliver that sort of humour very well, then fine, go for it. It's just that I was listening to a podcast earlier this week, and it was 3 people involved in it, and one of them insisted on inserting this running joke all the way through of adopting this sort of persona, like a sort of skater dude or something, and he kept shouting, hey bro, and this kind of stuff. And you could tell that even the other 2 podcasters were getting irritated with it. I certainly was, and in the end, even though it was a subject I was interested in, I had to stop listening because it was annoying me so much. So, unless you're good at impressions and funny voices and telling bad jokes, I can talk, right? Then just be careful with that. And quite often, less is more. So the next thing we're going to talk about is enunciation, diction and pronunciation. Very important, of course, that when we speak, people can understand what we're saying. Thankfully, long gone are the days of that sort of BBC English, the Queen's English and a house. I've been to my house and that kind of stuff, which is very clear, right? Very understandable in a sense, but not very engaging. And of course, now on TV or radio or anywhere else, we hear regional accents and all the rest of it, which is great. Everyone can speak the way they were brought up to speak. So don't worry if you've got an accent, for example. One podcast I listen to a lot is Frankie Boyle, Here Comes the Guillotine, which is himself and 2 fellow Glaswegian comedians speaking, just sort of almost like jamming comedy stuff. Now, I do have a Glaswegian friend or 2, so I'm quite used to that accent. But even so, very strong accent, but their diction is very good. I guess they're all stand-up comics, right? So they know how to project and enunciate and all the rest of it, even with that broad Glaswegian accent. So don't worry about accents, but do take care to ensure that you're speaking clearly. Part of that means not rushing your words as well. Again, sometimes when the red light goes on, what we call the red light fever, people can freeze. I've seen that happen in studios. People forget what they're there for. The other thing is, particularly with speaking, is people get a little bit nervous and they start speaking very quick and they think, oh, we'll get all this over very quickly and it's done. And the breath starts going and everything else. So a good thing to practice is to record yourself. And you can just read something out of a book, or you can just talk about what you did yesterday. What did you do yesterday? Well, I got in the car, it was about 10 o'clock, I'd fed the chickens, I was going down to Tesco's, I needed to buy some da-da-da-da-da. So just record yourself doing something like that and play it back and listen to how clearly you speak. If you find that you've, then, that's something you can look at and address. And again, a lot of this is dependent on the nature of the subject you're covering in your podcast. It can be tempting when we're doing weird fiction and we're covering some of the more sort of ghosty or horror stories to start speaking a bit like, ooh, Again, if you're good at that stuff, go for it. If not, then just be careful. You can always look at adding effects in on the voice. So quite often if we do an extended reading, or sometimes we'll do a reading of a whole story or a poem, then we might put a little bit of reverb on the voice just to give it that bit of atmosphere. We might put lay in a sound effect, a quiet sound effect underneath, perhaps some spooky wind or that kind of thing. So there are ways of adding to the atmosphere of your voice, but whatever you add to it, people have to be able to understand what it is you're actually saying. The next thing to consider are those unwanted noises. Some of these we make ourselves, others come from around us. Let's look at those external ones first. One of the biggest is the squeaky chair. I can't get this chair to squeak now. That's sod's law, isn't it? Normally, when you don't want it to, it squeaks. So be aware of that. Again, it's something you can deal with in editing, but better if it's not there at all. perhaps a bit of WD-40, or maybe get a new chair. And we've already spoken about your environment for recording, right? So you want somewhere that's as quiet as possible. Paradoxically, sometimes the quieter your space is, the more these extra noises will intrude. And especially, again, if people have headphones on, they'll really pick them up. That's one reason why usually when I edit our podcasts, I do them on headphones as well, just to pick up any of those background noises. So we've got the squeaky chair or the creaky table or whatever it might be. Another thing is the thump on the desk. Sometimes I hear this quite a bit. So the person has their mic on a stand on the desk, and of course they come forward, lean on the desk, and that boom goes in to the microphone. Again, can be edited out usually, but even better if it's not there in the first place. And of course our body makes other noises as well as we're talking. We've spoken about the idea of plosives, that p, p, p sound, which we can usually get around by using a pop shield or similar, or putting a muffler on the mic. That will usually help with that. They can be taken care of in editing as well. For me, I find it's not P so much, but K. Sometimes a K in a word can come out very loud and the voice sort of clicks for some reason. So you can be aware of that while you're speaking. So you can be aware of that while you're speaking, and again you can listen in. So you can be aware of that while you're speaking, and of course you can sort that out in the edit as well. Some people have strange habits when they speak. Another podcast I listened to recently, the guy was very interesting and very knowledgeable, but he had a habit of doing this sort of click at the end of every sentence. So he'd say something about, yes, so of course the Panzer IV tank was the workhorse of the German army. That was starting to drive me a bit mad. A far more common habit is where people use a particular word over and over again. The word might be something like or it might be something like, or they might say, you see. So I'm talking to you now in my microphone, you see, and later on I'm going to upload this, you see. So, you know, that's okay. That's part of people's natural speech patterns. But again, depending on what sort of podcast you're putting out, you might find that intrusive. You might find, especially with the that it gets a bit too much. And I have had that in the past where I can't remember the exact figure. In a sort of 45-minute podcast, I edited and cut out just a huge number of It's like every third word or so was really an and it was you know. So this can be down to a number of things. Of course, people are nervous about public speaking, or they're not really used to speaking in this way. Sometimes it's that you need to think for a little bit. So you develop this knack after a while, if you're any sort of public speaker, of being able to think ahead a little bit. So while my voice is saying something here, I'm already sort of thinking of the next thing that I'm saying. So otherwise, if I focus totally on what I'm saying now, then I've got to add that little pause in to get that next lot of information working in the brain. So to some extent, that's a matter of experience and practice. I mean, I'm lucky in that I've been teaching for, 30 odd years, I guess. So I'm very used to standing up in front of a group of people, whether it's martial arts or Tai Chi or whatever sort of training we're doing, just telling them what we're doing, explaining it and everything else. Consequently, I found when I've been asked to go into, could be a company, or it could be the WI or similar organisations, or I have to get up at an event like the Innsmouth Literary Festival, which is coming up in about a month's time, and talk to an audience. It doesn't really bother me that much. As long as I know what I'm talking about, then I'm confident, and I find I don't really get into ums and ahs and everything else. But that's, that's years of experience. So another good thing to do, if you find you are umming and ahhing a bit and are quite hesitant, is to put yourself in situations where you have to speak in public a bit. Now, there's different ways you can do that. I guess there's things like evening classes for different things, or you might just want to get some friends together and say, can you help me out? I just want to talk about this to you and I want you to tell me how it sounds. That kind of stuff. Really, at the end of the day, as the old cliche goes, the only way to get better at it is just to keep doing it. Built into this as well, and we all do it, if you look at any film or any TV program or you know, some of the specific programs or on YouTube, you'll always get your bloopers, right? So the best actors in the world at some point are going to fluff their lines, mispronounce something, forget their lines and all that. How much more so for us mere amateur podcasters, especially when we're working with something like or an author like Clark Ashton Smith, who has words like sesquipedalian and you know, and virtually unpronounceable names. So mistakes are going to happen. Now again, there's a couple of ways around that. You can leave them in. No one minds if you mispronounce something every now and again. In fact, we normally make a joke out of it. What also happens with ours is we swear, right? One of us mispronounces something and you go, oh, for fuck's sake, because you get annoyed with yourself, and the other one laughs. So I usually edit those out. I did say to Tim at one point, perhaps we should do a bloopers thing, but I think it'd probably end up being longer than a normal episode. So let's go on to those internal noises, or what we might call the human noises, because we're all human, right? Well, most of us, from the look of it. Our bodies make noise, sometimes without us having any control over that at all. We breathe. One of the biggest things you'll hear if a person is very close to the mic is you can pick up the sound of the breath, particularly between sentences. Now, this might be okay. You can live with that. You might be like me. I think I'm a little bit sensitive to noise. My wife will tell you one of my worst situations is noisy eaters. And we've had times before when we've had guests round for dinner or a meal, and one of them is a known very noisy eater. So I have to put some music on in the background. Then I can focus on the music and not on that horrible mastication. So there's something about that that sets me off. You may be the same, or maybe it's just my just part of my OCD. So we breathe. And one way to avoid that is, again, just to slow down in your presentation, because normally the quicker you speak, then you need to take a bigger breath at the end of each sentence. If you're speaking slower, then the breathing tends to be more relaxed and more natural. Now, breathwork is a huge subject in itself. Of course, that's something I work a lot in my day job, teaching martial arts and teaching health and fitness and well-being, meditation and so on. In fact, in the near future, I am going to be launching a new series on YouTube on my health channel, looking at tips on breathing and breathwork and posture and all sorts of other stuff. So please do keep an eye out for that. But really, as far as the breath goes, the important thing is before you start, just take a minute or two. Take a few breaths, and then you're ready to begin. And of course, you're going to be breathing throughout, but there'll be subtle, natural breaths rather than big, noisy gulps for air. And finally, we'll talk about preparation, because of course we've prepared in that we've chosen our subject, we've researched it, I hope, we're ready to say something about it. It might be that we work from notes, it might be that we can do this, you know, off the top of our heads. Usually it's a mixture of the two. And of course, when you're working in a conversation with someone, personally, I don't like to have that too scripted. I do know and do listen to podcasts where everything is scripted, even the banter. And it's okay, you know, they do it okay, but I can feel that it's scripted a little bit. So again, you don't want to lose that natural rhythm of speech and that back and forth. So there's a mix there in preparation in terms of knowing what you're going to be talking about and having everything scripted. Generally speaking, when we have people in for an interview, we'll give them a list. We'll say things like, well, the first thing we're going to ask you is about your background. Then we'll ask you what you're working on at the moment. What's your favourite film? You know, general questions like that. But it gives us the leeway to get into other areas from there. So the conversation will naturally flow into other areas. In terms of preparing the actual voice, there's a few things that we can do as well. The first thing I'd always recommend, and this goes for if you have to make a speech at a wedding as well or something like that. So first thing is, we've got our breathing, right? We're nice and calm. Second thing is, have a glass of water to hand, because the throat will tend to dry out if you get a little bit nervous. Or of course, if you're speaking for quite a while, then the throat will naturally dry. I often sort of suck a cough sweet or something like that beforehand, just so the passages are nice and clear. You can also get into warm-ups. If you go onto YouTube, there's a whole host of advice from professional singers and the like on warming up the voice. There's all those sort of exercises you can do to loosen the mouth and the jaw, all that kind of stuff. And then there's all the sort of you know. Obviously, they're things that singers use a lot to warm up the voice, but they're all very useful exercises if you want to speak well as well. So there we go. I think that's about it for the voice. If I have missed anything out, or if you do have any questions or suggestions, of course, as well, then please do pop them below. It's always nice to hear from viewers. And if you haven't already, please do like and subscribe to the channel and share it around your friends as well. This year, I really want to get the channel growing, and well, there's a ton of ideas coming up. I'm going to be putting out an upload very soon, talking about the next phase in the channel and some of the plans we've got for moving ahead. Of course, we're going to continue with this podcasting series. So next time, we're going to look at actually getting your podcast out there, how to upload it, which sites to use, and we'll start to look at how you market and promote your podcast as well. I'll see you then.